So we have to get from here to the stationary sources, and generally speaking, section 111, which is what this is, establishes that any pollutant otherwise regulated by the Act must have a standard of performance created for it. Well, what is the standard of performance? And this is the section, one of the sections that ultimately the Supreme Court will have to consider if it gets around to deciding whether a Clean Power Plan is, or was, legitimate. It's supposed to be bolded. So the administrator has to create a standard of performance for sources of CO2. What is the standard of performance? It is the best system of emission reduction that has been adequately demonstrated. Best system of emission reduction adequately demonstrated. Well, what is that? And how do you go about doing it? The Obama administration had a particular opinion of what that meant, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. And the Trump administration has a different opinion. Who decides? Well, the person who decides is the EPA administrator. But you can see there's a significant range of amount of discretion in deciding what's best, what's been adequately demonstrated. These are, of course, still intelligible principles. So that's the Clean Air Act. What is the ES? What kind of discretion does the ESA grant? So this is from the Endangered. Oh, excuse me. I went to the Clean Water Act first. This is from the Clean Water Act. Clean Water Act prohibits the discharge of a pollutant, and then it defines discharge of a pollutant as addition of any pollutant to the navigable waters. And then it defines navigable waters like this: waters of the United States. So you cannot discharge pollutants into the waters of the United States. What are those? All the water in the United States? Only some of it? And if so, how do you decide what the sum of it is? It is only some of it. The court has decided that the reference to navigable waters means that there has to be some element of navigability in there. But how much, the court hasn't said, and Congress since 1972 has not come in to help us out. There are a few efforts to define this better, but that's the definition we have. So we talk about the Waters of the United States rule, or the WOTUS rule. It's about trying to figure out what that definition means and where it applies. And this has been incredibly controversial and complicated and is ongoing. The Supreme Court has been dealing with this since the 80s and has not yet given us much guidance. This is the Endangered Species Act, and I'll show you this provision because it deals with the sage grouse, and then the next one that deals with land use plans. Again, this is about how much discretion the agencies have. So this is directing the Secretaries of Commerce and Interior, depending on where the species is. Commerce has authority over anadromous fish, so we hear about salmon, you'll hear NOAA Fisheries, or the Secretary of Commerce, marine mammals and marine species. Fish and Wildlife Service, or the Secretary of the Interior, is terrestrial species. Long story as to why, but two different secretaries. So they decide whether something is endangered or threatened, and that's the category that creates all of the protections. If it's not listed as endangered or threatened, it doesn't get any protection from the ESA. Based on 5 factors, and I've only shown 2 here. The present or threatened destruction, modification, or curtailment of its habitat or range, or the inadequacy of existing regulatory mechanisms. Now the first one is very much a scientific determination. And that's what they do. They look at all of the historic habitat, the amount of habitat needed, what potential land uses are, how much they will affect that habitat to decide what the future of the species is. Required to use the best scientific and commercial data available and engaging in this analysis. But again, it's not obvious what that means. And then the inadequacy of existing regulatory mechanisms. That's just a judgment as to whether state law will be sufficient to protect the species, or whether the federal law needs to come in unless it is threatened. Again, it's sort of a judgment call. Some of those existing regulatory mechanisms, I said state law, some of them, of course, can be the other federal statutes. And one in particular, the Federal Land Policy and Management Act, this is what regulates the public lands. It requires the Secretary to create land use plans, or to manage them. I'll show you the land use plan one next. Under principles of multiple use and sustained yield. And then in developing the land use plans that the Secretary will use to manage those lands, there's a whole list, but I picked 2 that are relevant. Use a systematic interdisciplinary approach to achieve integrated consideration of physical, biological, economic, and other sciences, and give priority to the designation and protection of areas of critical environmental concern. So conceivably, this choice could protect enough sage-grouse habitat that there are adequate existing regulatory mechanisms that you wouldn't have to list. But the thing to see here, and this is what we often forget, the Secretariat shall manage the public lands under principles of multiple use. What are the multiple uses that we have decided, that we as a community, that all of us together have decided the public lands can be used for? You ever thought, what can they be, what are they for?
Commercial.
Oil and gas development, timber harvesting, grazing, wildlife habitat, recreation, all of those things. We have said as a community that, yeah, oil and gas is something that we want to do out there. So is ranching and sage-grouse habitat. And so how do you balance all of those things in one place? Right? And that is what the executive gets to do. Decide how that balance occurs. We used to have, I used to represent energy companies. We talk about doing the Lord's work. We were their environmental compliance people, making sure they didn't break the rules. But they would often get challenged because they would intervene in challenges to BLM decisions because the BLM was not allowing land to be used for recreation or something, because it had a coal mine on it. If you've been to a coal mine, you know there's not a whole lot of animals out there running around in the coal mine. And so it can't be used for wildlife habitat, it can't be used for recreation, it can't be used for the other uses. And what we would say, and what the courts always agreed with, was it doesn't say that every parcel has to be used for all uses. It just means the entire landscape has to be managed for multiple uses. So that is where this capacity comes from in three specific instances: Clean Power Plan, the Washington United States Rule, and sage-grouse. So for the next 10 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions about these or anything else, we're going to talk about how that's been playing out on the ground with the Trump administration. So the first one I mentioned, make sure I'm keeping track of where I am. Okay, so the first one I mentioned is this is the what is happening. It's the Clean Power Plan. So this is just in the news last week. This is a coal-fired power plant. These are nice pictures. If you ever look at these, the big stack, the one that's most ominous looking, that one's largely harmless. That's all steam. That's a cooling tower. So just steam coming off from the superheated water. These are the two that matter. Those are the boilers. So this is where the pollution's coming out with a few like auxiliary things. Clean Power Plan was an effort to regulate carbon dioxide. That's what it's for. So what did it do? It did a couple things. Primarily, it regulates carbon dioxide from existing power plants, not from new ones. The regulation of new or modified major stationary sources still exists. This, or it's separate, excuse me. This regulated CO2 from existing power plants. A huge percentage of our power comes from coal. Up here in the Pacific Northwest, we tend to forget about that, or it's out of sight, out of mind, because all we're doing is killing salmon, and somehow we think that's okay. It's non-carbon producing power, of course, but it does have harmful effects. I tell my students, when they get upset about the dam, say, well, you right now at that computer are, in fact, killing salmon, so let's keep that in mind. Not a good thing, and it's not to excuse it, but so what it does is it establishes goals for each state based on their existing power portfolio and how much they are anticipated. We're anticipated to be able to reduce carbon outputs. And then it created 3 ways in which to achieve those goals. And this is a very brief overview of a very complicated plan. First, you have to reduce carbon emissions from your existing plant. So it created a standard of performance that required reduction of carbon emissions. That's the step 1. Step 2, if you can't do that, you can trade coal for natural gas. Natural gas produces less CO2 than coal does. It's a way to reduce our carbon emissions. But then there's the third way, trade coal for solar or wind. These also, when we practiced, or when we represented wind industries, we used to call them, not with the climbers there, raptormatics, because they tend to chop up birds. They also have effects, but they don't produce CO2. So that was the strategy. And it was based on that standard of performance language, which the Obama administration said it says best system of emission reduction. Best system. And they said, okay, what is a system of emissions reduction? And decided it included all of these things. as a system, not just focused on the specific plant itself.